In 1920, the world built a machine to end all war. 19 years later, that machine watched the deadliest conflict in human history begin and did nothing to stop it. 42 nations signed the promise. Millions of people believed it. And one by one, the men running it chose comfort over confrontation every single time it mattered. This is the story of the League of Nations, the peace that was supposed to save the world, and the slow, preventable way it let the world burn instead. By 1918, the First World War had killed somewhere between 15 and 20 million people. Entire villages lost a generation of young men in a single afternoon of shelling. 4 empires collapsed within months of each other. In some British towns, the list of the dead was so long that entire streets went unrepresented at the victory parade, because there was no one left from those families to march. Out of that wreckage came an idea that felt almost inevitable: a permanent forum where nations settled disputes with words, not artillery, a parliament of the world. American President Woodrow Wilson became its loudest champion. A League of Nations, he argued, wasn't a nice idea. It was the only way to make sure this war had actually been the war to end all wars. He toured the country to sell it personally, exhausting himself in the process, collapsing from a stroke on a campaign train in October 1919, partially paralyzed for the rest of his presidency, fighting for an institution his own Senate would ultimately refuse to join. He never fully recovered. He would spend his final years in the White House largely hidden from public view, his wife quietly managing decisions in his place, while the organization he had staked his health and his legacy on opened its doors in Geneva without a single American delegate in the room. He was about to be proven catastrophically wrong, and the first crack was already forming before a single meeting was held. Inside the exhausted negotiating rooms of the Paris Peace Conference, diplomats had already spent months fighting over borders and reparations. Into that cynicism, Wilson pushed his league, and remarkably, it survived. The covenant was folded directly into the Treaty of Versailles, signed June 1919. Member states pledged to respect each other's borders, submit disputes to arbitration, and apply collective force against any nation that broke the peace. On January 10, 1920, the League opened in Geneva, 42 founding members. For one hopeful moment, it looked like the war had produced something worth its staggering cost. Its structure was built around an assembly where every member state got a voice, and a council where the great powers were meant to hold real authority. It sounded balanced on paper. In practice, it meant the organization's teeth depended entirely on a handful of nations agreeing to use them together, every single time, with no exceptions and no shortcuts. Then came the twist nobody in the room wanted to say out loud. In November 1919, the United States Senate refused to ratify the Treaty of Versailles. The country that proposed the League, the rising economic power of the century, would never actually join the organization Wilson built his legacy on. Picture that irony directly. The architect of world peace, standing in Geneva only in spirit, his own flag missing from a room full of nations far smaller than his own. Without America, the League's promise of collective security was hollow from day one. Germany and the Soviet Union weren't even invited at first, excluded from the very peace their exclusion helped destabilize. The foundation had a crack in it before the doors even opened, and for a while, almost nobody noticed. Buried inside the covenant itself was a second weakness, quieter than America's absence, but just as fatal. Article 16 promised collective action against aggressors, but left the exact response to the judgment of each individual member state. There was no standing League army, no automatic trigger, no mechanism forcing a reluctant nation to actually fight or even meaningfully sanction a country breaking the peace. In effect, the League had built a fire alarm with no fire department required to answer it. Every response, in every crisis, would depend entirely on whether powerful nations felt like showing up that particular week. Sometimes they did. Increasingly, as the 1930s wore on, they simply didn't. Here's the part most people never hear. In 1925, the League mediated a border dispute between Greece and Bulgaria and stopped it cold before it became a war. It resettled hundreds of thousands of displaced refugees. It built international health networks that tracked epidemics across borders years before anyone imagined a World Health Organization. It even helped broker the return of prisoners of war still stranded in Siberia years after the fighting had ended, men their own governments had quietly written off. For its first decade, the League proved something real. Small fires could be stopped. Nobody yet knew if it could survive a fire a great power actually wanted to start. In 1931, that test arrived, and everything the League had built its reputation on was about to be exposed as theater. September 1931, Japanese forces staged an explosion on a railway line in Manchuria, blamed Chinese saboteurs, and used it as pretext to seize the entire region within months. China appealed to the League. The League investigated. It condemned the invasion in a formal report. And then it did almost nothing else. No military response. Sanctions debated for months, never enforced. In 1933, Japan simply walked out of the League entirely and paid no real price for it. Japanese delegate Yasuke Matsuoka walked out of the assembly hall to a standing ovation back home, greeted as a national hero. For defying an organization the rest of the world was quickly learning it could safely ignore. The message reached every ambitious power on Earth instantly. The League could write you a strongly worded letter. It could not stop you from keeping what you took. In 1932, a League-appointed commission traveled to Manchuria and produced a detailed report confirming exactly what everyone already suspected. Japan had staged the entire incident to justify an invasion planned well in advance. The report was thorough. It was accurate. It was also completely toothless. The League adopted its findings, condemned Japan formally, and then watched Japan simply leave the room. Diplomats in Geneva privately called it a disaster. Publicly, they called it a firm stance. The gap between those two descriptions would define the rest of the League's existence. A young journalist covering the Geneva sessions that year wrote in his notebook that he had just watched the League commit suicide in slow motion, and that nobody in the building seemed to notice the body was already cold. If Manchuria was a crack, this was the moment the wall came down. October 1935. Mussolini's Italy invaded Abyssinia, modern Ethiopia, a League member itself, using poison gas on soldiers and civilians, violating agreements Italy had personally signed. Ethiopia's emperor, Haile Selassie, traveled to Geneva and stood before the entire assembly. His warning still echoes. What happens to my country today will happen to yours tomorrow, if collective security only protects the powerful. The League voted for sanctions. But oil, the one resource that could have crippled Mussolini's war machine instantly, was deliberately left off the list, out of fear of provoking Italy into open war. Ethiopia fell, Mussolini kept it, and every dictator in Europe now had proof in writing that the League's threats meant nothing. Selassie would spend the coming years in exile in England, watching from a distance as the very continent that had failed to save his country marched toward the same fate he had warned them about, almost word for word. Once that lesson was learned, it spread fast. Hitler remilitarized the Rhineland in 1936. No serious response. He annexed Austria in 1938. He dismantled Czechoslovakia in 1939, piece by piece. While the organization built to prevent exactly this issued statement after statement, Britain and France, the two powers with the most influence inside the League, kept choosing appeasement over confrontation. Hopping each concession would be the last one required. British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain returned from Munich in 1938, waving a piece of paper he called "Peace for Our Time," a phrase that would be repeated for the rest of the century, almost always with bitter irony attached to it. It never was, not once. September 1st, 1939, Germany invaded Poland. Within 2 days, Britain and France declared war. The Second World War had begun, less than 20 years after an organization was built specifically to make this exact moment impossible. The League didn't formally die right away. It limped on through the war years, its Geneva halls nearly empty, ignored by a world already burning. In April 1946, it officially dissolved, handing its buildings and its unfinished promise to a new attempt built from the wreckage of its failure. The United Nations, the same Geneva building the League once occupied, still stands today, repurposed as the United Nations office in Geneva. Its halls now hosting the very kind of negotiations the League once believed it had already perfected. The League of Nations wasn't a foolish idea. Its founders understood something true. The alternative to cooperation was the exact catastrophe they'd just survived. But a promise between nations is only as strong as the willingness of powerful countries to keep it when keeping it is inconvenient. The League could investigate aggression. It could condemn it in beautiful language, in grand halls, in front of assembled diplomats. What it could never do, when it actually mattered, was stop it. Manchuria proved that quietly. Abyssinia proved it in gas and blood, and an emperor's unanswered warning. By 1939, the entire world was paying for a peace that had never truly been enforced, only politely requested. Tens of millions of lives later, that lesson still hasn't fully been learned. It's still being tested, right now, in rooms not so different from the one in Geneva. Every institution built to keep the peace since 1945 carries the League's ghost inside it. The same fundamental question still unanswered. What happens when the nations powerful enough to enforce a promise decide, quietly, that enforcing it costs more than breaking it? The League never found an answer to that question. Neither, in truth, has anyone since. And the cost of that unanswered question is still being counted. In wars fought right now, in places the diplomats of 1920 could never have imagined.